You've already felt the shift, not in a dramatic way, not as an event, just a quiet change in the way your attention holds something or doesn't. There's a difference between thinking about something and staying with it. You've noticed that. A thought appears. It feels alive for a moment. Then something interrupts it. Another idea, a memory, a doubt, a subtle drift. And whatever felt close fades. This isn't about effort. It isn't about forcing belief. It's about something much simpler. A threshold. There's a point in your own awareness where something stabilizes, where your perception stops flickering, where your inner signal stops scattering. Most people never stay long enough to notice that point, not because they can't, but because they've never felt what happens when they do. You've come close. There have been moments, small ones, when you held a thought, a feeling, an image just long enough for it to feel different, more solid, less imagined, as if it began holding you back. And maybe you brushed it off. Maybe you assumed it was coincidence, or mood, or imagination, but something in you remembers that moment. There's a quiet reaction that happens when your attention stops breaking itself apart. Not dramatic, not explosive, just a response. Around the 3rd minute of watching this, you may begin to notice something subtle, not in the words, in the way your focus is settling, as if the act of staying here is already changing something you haven't named. You've lived most of your life with divided attention, part of you wanting something, another part questioning it, another part remembering the past, another part bracing for disappointment. It's not weakness, it's habit. And habit creates a kind of static in the field of your own perception. When attention fragments, reality feels delayed, distant, unresponsive. But when attention stabilizes, there's a moment, brief, precise, where something aligns. Not outside you, inside. You've probably experienced it in simple ways. When you were completely absorbed in something, a conversation, music, a memory, a vision of what could be. For a few seconds, there was no internal argument, no background commentary, just continuity. And in those seconds, things felt different, closer, not because anything changed externally, but because your perception stopped contradicting itself. That continuity matters more than you think. There's a reason why scattered desire feels weak, and sustained presence feels powerful. It's not about intensity, it's about coherence. When your attention stays with one internal signal long enough, your nervous system stops resisting it. Your identity softens around it. Your sense of maybe begins to shift into something steadier. 19 seconds isn't magical. It's structural. It's just long enough for fragmentation to dissolve. Just long enough for doubt to lose momentum. Just long enough for your internal mirror to stop distorting what you're holding. You don't need to do anything dramatic. You've already done it before without realizing. Think about the last time you replayed a memory you didn't like. You stayed with it, not intentionally, but continuously, and your body reacted. Your mood shifted. Your perception changed. The world felt different for a while. That wasn't random. Your awareness held a signal long enough for your entire internal field to reorganize around it. You see this everywhere if you look closely. When someone holds resentment, reality keeps reflecting conflict. When someone stays in gratitude, not forced, but steady, their perception begins to filter differently, not because the world is biased, but because perception is active. Reality doesn't argue with the signal you consistently emit. It reflects it. There's a quiet intelligence in that, not judgment, not reward, reflection. Around 10 minutes in, something deeper begins to settle. You may notice that this isn't about attracting anything. It's about stabilizing who you are long enough for your identity to stop shifting back and forth. That instability, that inner switching, is what creates delay. You've been trying to move forward while internally stepping back, not consciously, just habitually. And every time your focus breaks before it stabilizes, the pattern resets. It's subtle. You hold an intention. It feels real for a few seconds. Then a thought slips in. What if it doesn't work? Is this realistic? Maybe later. That small interruption dissolves continuity. The signal weakens. Not because the field is silent, but because you changed the message mid-transmission. You don't need stronger belief. You need steadier presence. When attention holds without interruption, something shifts in your sense of identity. You stop feeling like someone waiting. You begin feeling like someone already aligned. And alignment isn't effort, it's consistency. Imagine holding a single thought, not intensely, just clearly. No emotional strain, no forcing, just continuity. At first, your mind resists. It tries to move, to check, to evaluate. But if you remain with it, around 19 seconds, something inside quiet. It's almost physical, as if the internal argument ran out of energy, and what remains feels neutral, stable, real. That stability is what the field responds to, not desire, not desperation, stability. You've mistaken intensity for effectiveness, but coherence is quieter. It feels ordinary at first, unremarkable. That's why most people miss it. They expect fireworks. They overlook stillness. There's a moment, small but precise, when your perception stops searching and starts settling. That moment is the turning point. Not externally, internally. You can sense it even now. The way your awareness is holding these words a little longer than usual. The way you're not rushing ahead. The way something in you is staying. That's continuity. And continuity reorganizes identity. Around 20 minutes into this, you might realize something unexpected. You don't actually want faster results. You want steadiness. You want your inner world to stop contradicting itself. You want your choices to feel aligned instead of reactive. And that begins in the space between thoughts. When you sustain one internal orientation long enough, your nervous system recalibrates. Time feels different, less pressured, less delayed, because delay isn't always external. It's often internal hesitation repeating itself. You've been waiting for reality to change before you commit internally. But reality has been waiting for your internal signal to stop shifting. That doesn't mean forcing certainty. It means holding a direction long enough for doubt to exhaust itself. 19 seconds is long enough for your brain to begin accepting what you're holding, long enough for your body to soften, long enough for your perception to stop questioning. And once something feels familiar, it no longer feels distant. You might recognize this from other areas of your life. When you decided something fully, without mental backtracking, events began aligning faster, not magically, just smoothly, because your identity stopped negotiating with itself. Alignment over effort, perception over struggle, awareness over force. There are parallel versions of you, not in some dramatic sense, but in simple choices. One version keeps fragmenting attention, another version holds steady. The difference isn't talent. It isn't luck. It's continuity. When you hold a signal clearly, reality feels less like a maze and more like a mirror. And mirrors don't argue. They reflect. There's a quiet global awakening happening. Not loud, not collective in obvious ways. Individual awareness stabilizing. People realizing they don't need to chase, they need to align. This isn't about controlling anything. It's about recognizing that perception itself is active. And once you feel that, you can't unfeel it. You don't need to change your life overnight. You don't need dramatic shifts. Just notice what happens when you hold something calmly for 19 uninterrupted seconds. Notice how your identity begins to lean toward it. Notice how your inner dialogue quiets. Notice how it stops feeling like imagination and starts feeling like orientation. There's nothing mystical here, just awareness recognizing itself as primary. You are not waiting for a signal. You are the one stabilizing it. And when your signal stabilizes, the reflection follows. You may find yourself later today remembering this, not as information, as a sensation, the feeling of continuity, the absence of inner conflict. That's the threshold, not a technique. A remembering. In the same way parallel realities explores how identity shifts subtly across perception, this awareness doesn't ask you to believe anything new. It invites you to notice what already happens when you stay. You don't need more intensity. You need less interruption. And maybe that's what you've been sensing all along. That nothing was ever truly blocked, only fragmented. Now, as this conversation gently fades, there's no conclusion. Just a quiet extension. You will close this video, but something in you will keep holding longer than before. And in that steadiness, you may begin to feel it, not as a lesson, as recognition. You didn't learn something. You remembered how your attention shapes what feels real. And maybe for just 19 seconds at a time, that's enough. You've noticed something subtle already. The way your attention feels heavier now, not distracted, just anchored. When you hold a thought without interruption, there's a moment when it stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like identity. That transition is quiet. No sound, no visible shift. Just a slight internal settling. It's easy to miss. Most people do. They expect change to feel dramatic, but the most stable changes are barely perceptible at first. There's a difference between imagining something and inhabiting it. You can imagine for hours and remain unchanged. Or you can stay with one clear internal orientation long enough for it to feel natural. And when something feels natural, your behavior adjusts without force. Your perception reorganizes without resistance. Your choices soften into alignment. That's what continuity does. It removes the friction between who you think you are and who you're becoming. You've felt that friction before. That subtle tension between desire and doubt, between clarity and hesitation. It's not dramatic. It's persistent. Like a low hum in the background. And every time your attention flickers away before it stabilizes, that hum remains. But when you stay, even for 19 seconds, the hum fades. There's a pause, not empty, just undisturbed. And in that pause, your nervous system stops scanning for contradiction. You're no longer asking if it's possible. You're simply holding it. That's when perception begins to shift. Not because the outside world rearranges instantly, but because your inner orientation stops retracting. There's something deeply stabilizing about internal consistency. When your thoughts, emotions, and attention line up, even briefly, your identity feels less fragmented. You stop feeling like someone trying to get somewhere. You feel like someone already standing in a direction. That direction matters because reality doesn't respond to wishful thinking. It reflects orientation. If your internal orientation changes every few seconds, the reflection remains scattered, but if it holds, even gently, the reflection becomes clearer. You may notice that when you hold a calm sense of certainty, not loud, not intense, people respond differently. Conversations shift. Timing feels smoother. Decisions feel lighter. It's not coincidence. It's coherence. Your awareness acts like a tuning dial. When it jumps frequencies, the signal distorts. When it holds steady, the signal strengthens. 19 seconds isn't about duration alone. It's about crossing the point where your mind stops negotiating. There's a small window in which doubt still has momentum. Before 19 seconds, it can interrupt easily. After 19 seconds, its influence weakens. You've experienced this when practicing anything new. At first, your mind resists. It wants to move on. But if you stay, resistance softens. Then something interesting happens. What felt foreign begins to feel familiar. And what feels familiar begins to feel real. That's how identity shifts. Not in grand declarations, in sustained attention. There are versions of you that already live in the state you imagine, not in some distant dimension, and simple internal posture. One version hesitates, another version holds. When you choose to hold, even briefly, you step closer to that steadier version. And the distance between those versions is smaller than you think. It's measured in seconds, not years. You don't need to convince yourself of anything. Convincing creates tension. Holding creates familiarity. When something becomes familiar, your subconscious stops resisting it. And when resistance fades, movement feels natural. You might notice right now that the concept of time feels softer, not because minutes have changed, but because your attention isn't chasing. When awareness stabilizes, time feels less linear, less urgent, more spacious. In that spaciousness, choices feel clearer. You're not reacting, you're orienting. That orientation is subtle power, not force, not control, just steadiness. You've been taught to chase results, to push, to try harder. But there's something more precise. Hold a single internal signal long enough for your body to accept it. That's all. When your body accepts it, your posture changes. When your posture changes, your interactions shift. When your interactions shift, outcomes follow. It's not mystical. It's reflective. Your internal field doesn't wait for permission. It mirrors consistency. If you hold fear consistently, life feels restrictive. If you hold clarity consistently, life feels navigable. The field is neutral. It amplifies continuity. And you've been amplifying fragmentation without realizing. Every time you shifted away, every time you interrupted your own alignment, there's no blame in that, just awareness. Now you're noticing, and noticing itself begins to stabilize perception. There's a quiet confidence in knowing that the shift isn't far away. It's not hidden. It's simply waiting for you to stop withdrawing attention. You don't need longer sessions. You need cleaner moments. 19 clean seconds of uninterrupted presence. Not trying, not checking, just staying. You may find that the first few seconds feel restless. That's natural. Your mind is accustomed to movement, but if you remain around the midpoint, something eases. And near the end of those 19 seconds, there's a sense of completion, not achievement, completion, as if a loop closed. That closure is what your identity recognizes. You begin to trust your own internal signal, and trust changes behavior quietly. You stop overthinking. You stop retracting. You begin choosing from steadiness rather than urgency, and urgency fades when alignment holds. There's a simplicity to this that can feel almost disappointing. No dramatic ritual, no complex framework, just continuity. But simplicity often hides power because it requires consistency. And consistency reshapes perception. You're not learning something new. You're remembering how your attention influences what feels solid. The world doesn't respond to fleeting impulses. It responds to stabilized identity. And identity stabilizes through repetition of coherent attention. 19 seconds is enough to begin that repetition. Enough to cross from idea into embodiment, enough to feel the difference between imagining and inhabiting. You may not see immediate external changes, but you'll feel internal steadiness. And steadiness precedes visible shifts. There's a version of you already living with that steadiness, calm, clear, unhurried. You don't need to reach them. You need to hold their posture long enough to recognize it as yours. Reality doesn't rush, it reflects. And reflection becomes clearer when the signal stops flickering. So when you think about what you want next, notice the impulse to check. Notice the urge to doubt, then simply hold. Not tightly, just steadily. 19 seconds at a time. And observe how the sense of distance begins to dissolve. Not because something new is added, but because something fragmented became whole. That's where response begins, quietly, naturally, inevitably. There's something else you may begin to notice the moment you decide to hold a thought steadily. Another part of you immediately tries to measure it. Is this working? Am I doing it right? How long has it been? That measuring mind is subtle. It doesn't feel negative. It feels responsible, but it interrupts continuity. And continuity is the entire point. When you hold something for 19 seconds, it isn't about endurance. It's about non-interruption. The smallest internal question can break the signal, not because questions are wrong, but because they split attention. Split attention weakens identity. You've lived in split attention for years. Part of you hopeful, part of you cautious, part of you remembering failure, part of you imagining success, all at once. That internal division feels normal, but it creates a kind of invisible delay. Not outside you, inside. When identity splits, perception becomes inconsistent. When perception becomes inconsistent, reflection looks unstable. It feels like life is unpredictable. But unpredictability often mirrors internal contradiction. You may recall moments when you were absolutely certain about something, not loudly certain, quietly certain. In those moments, things moved. Opportunities appeared. People aligned. Timing felt precise. That wasn't luck. It was continuity. Certainty isn't about arrogance. It's about steadiness. When you stop retracting your own orientation, the world feels less resistant. You're not fighting reality. You're aligning with it, and alignment feels almost ordinary. There's no rush, no dramatic surge, just smoothness. You've mistaken smoothness for boredom before because you were used to intensity. But intensity often comes from conflict. Steadiness comes from coherence. When you hold an internal image or feeling for 19 uninterrupted seconds, you cross a subtle threshold. Before that point, your mind still sees it as optional. After that point, it begins to treat it as natural. That shift from optional to natural is everything, because reality reflects what feels natural to you. Not what you wish were true, not what you argue for, what feels normal. 19 seconds is enough for something new to begin feeling normal, even slightly. And once something feels normal, your nervous system relaxes into it. Relaxation is powerful. When you're relaxed, you stop gripping outcomes. You stop chasing confirmation. You begin moving from quiet confidence instead of anxious anticipation. There's a difference between wanting something and being aligned with it. Wanting feels like reaching. Alignment feels like standing. You don't reach for what you believe is already part of your path. You move toward it calmly, or sometimes it moves toward you. And the difference between reaching and standing is measured in continuity. If your attention wavers every few seconds, you remain in wanting. If your attention holds steadily, you begin standing. Standing changes posture. Posture changes decisions. Decisions change trajectory. You see how subtle this is. There's no external battle, just internal stability, and stability compounds. One 19-second moment doesn't transform everything, but it shifts orientation. Repeated orientation reshapes identity. Identity reshapes perception. Perception reshapes experience. It's not mystical, it's cumulative. You may notice something interesting as you reflect on your past. The times when things shifted in your life weren't always preceded by dramatic effort. Sometimes they were preceded by a quiet internal decision. A moment when you stopped wavering, when you said internally, "This is who I am now," and you held it. Not aggressively, just steadily. Those were your alignment points. You've had more than you remember, but you didn't recognize the pattern. You attributed the results to circumstance, to timing, to coincidence. Yet the common factor was always continuity. You held something long enough for it to stabilize. The field doesn't respond to emotional spikes. It responds to sustained coherence. Spikes fade. Coherence accumulates. When you hold an internal state for 19 seconds, you begin training your perception to treat it as baseline. Baseline is powerful. What feels baseline no longer feels distant. And what doesn't feel distant begins to integrate. Integration is quiet. You won't see fireworks. You'll feel familiarity. A subtle sense that something fits, and when something fits, you don't question it, you embody it. That embodiment is what reality mirrors. You've been waiting for external confirmation before embodying, but embodiment precedes confirmation. That's the inversion most people miss. They wait to feel aligned after evidence appears, but evidence appears after alignment stabilizes. Not instantly, but inevitably. When your internal signal stops flickering, reflection stops distorting. It becomes clear. Clear doesn't mean perfect. It means consistent. Consistency creates trust. Trust reduces doubt. Reduced doubt increases continuity. And continuity strengthens identity. You can feel this cycle beginning even now. The way your awareness is less restless than before. The way you're not searching for a dramatic breakthrough, just absorbing something familiar. That familiarity is recognition. You're not adding knowledge. You're noticing a pattern that's always been there. Your attention is not passive. It is formative, not in a forceful way, in a reflective way. The field of your experience doesn't punish or reward. It mirrors continuity. And when continuity stabilizes, response follows naturally. You don't need to push. You don't need to strain. You need to stop interrupting yourself. That interruption has been the only real distance. Once it softens, everything feels closer, not because the world changed overnight, but because you stop withdrawing. 19 seconds is enough to begin that shift, not dramatic, just decisive. And when you become decisive internally, hesitation loses its influence. The mirror clears, the signal holds, and what once felt distant begins to feel inevitable, quietly, naturally, without effort. That's the difference you've been sensing. And now you're recognizing it. There's a subtle moment that comes after steadiness. It isn't excitement. It isn't relief. It's quieter than that. It feels like neutrality. And most people mistake neutrality for nothing happening. But neutrality is where coherence deepens. When you hold something for 19 seconds, the first change is mental. The second change is physical. Your breathing shifts. Your posture softens. Your internal pressure reduces. You're no longer trying to make something happen. You're simply allowing yourself to remain in one orientation. That's rare, because you've been conditioned to move constantly, to evaluate, to adjust, to improve, to question. Movement feels productive. Stillness feels passive. But stillness is where alignment stabilizes. You felt this in moments when you were fully present with someone. No agenda. No internal commentary, just attention. And those moments felt meaningful, not because of what was said, but because of the continuity of awareness. That same principle applies inward. When you give uninterrupted attention to an internal state, it begins to root itself. Rooted identity feels calm. It doesn't seek validation. It doesn't rush toward proof. It doesn't panic when there's no immediate response. It simply remains. Remaining is powerful. Because when you remain steady, your perception stops scanning for contradiction. Scanning is exhausting. It keeps your nervous system alert. When scanning stops, clarity appears. And clarity doesn't need drama. It feels simple. So simple that you may doubt it. You may think, this can't be it. But that thought is just the old pattern trying to reassert itself. You're used to complexity. You're used to chasing. You're used to effort. But alignment isn't effort. It's internal consistency. There's something deeply stabilizing about not retracting your own signal. You've retracted more times than you realize. You felt certain about something, then immediately softened it. You imagined something clearly, then immediately diluted it with realism. You sensed a direction, then overanalyzed it. Every retraction weakened continuity, not permanently, just temporarily. Now imagine not retracting, not pushing harder, just not pulling back. 19 seconds without retraction, without mental editing, without internal commentary. You don't need to amplify emotion. In fact, the calmer it is, the stronger it stabilizes. High emotion can spike, calm coherence sustains. The field responds to sustained states, not spikes. Spikes are noise. Coherence is signal. When your signal becomes consistent, reflection begins aligning quietly. You might notice small confirmations, subtle shifts in how people respond, tiny adjustments in timing, not dramatic, just smooth. And smoothness is the first visible sign of alignment. But the deeper shift happens internally. You stop feeling divided. You stop feeling like you're persuading yourself. You stop feeling like you're waiting. Instead, you feel positioned. Position doesn't mean guaranteed. It means oriented. And orientation is what guides perception. When perception aligns, choices align. When choices align, outcomes follow. You don't need to chase outcomes. You need to hold orientation, that's all. There's a reason you've sensed that something about effort felt off. That pushing harder wasn't the answer, because pushing often comes from doubt. And doubt fractures attention. Fractured attention cannot stabilize identity. Stabilized identity shapes reflection. It's a quiet hierarchy. Attention gives identity, gives perception, gives experience. You've been trying to adjust experience directly, But experience mirrors perception. Perception mirrors identity. Identity stabilizes through attention, and attention holds for 19 seconds. It's not mystical, it's structural. You may begin noticing that when you hold an internal state steadily, you feel less reactive. Situations that would normally trigger you feel softer, not because you suppress reaction, but because your baseline has shifted. Baseline matters. If your baseline is instability, everything feels threatening. If your baseline is coherence, challenges feel navigable. Baseline is built in small increments, 19 seconds at a time, repeated gently, not obsessively, just consistently. You don't need to think about it constantly. You don't need to monitor it. You just need to practice not interrupting yourself. There's something almost humbling about realizing how small the threshold is. Not hours, not days, seconds. And yet those seconds require presence. They require you to resist the impulse to check, to doubt, to shift. That impulse has been your default. Now you're seeing it. Seeing it already weakens it. When you become aware of your own interruptions, you begin interrupting the interruption. And that's where continuity strengthens. You don't fight doubt. You simply don't follow it. You remain. That remaining is subtle strength. Strength without tension. Confidence without aggression. Stability without force. You may notice that as you hold this awareness, time feels different again. Less hurried. Less pressured. When you're not chasing results, you're not measuring time obsessively. You're inhabiting it. Inhabiting feels different from waiting. Waiting implies absence. Inhabiting implies presence. When you inhabit an internal state for 19 seconds, you're not waiting for it to become real. You're allowing it to integrate. Integration is quiet. No applause. No announcement. Just a subtle shift in how you feel about yourself. And how you feel about yourself influences every interaction. You may start speaking differently, choosing differently, responding differently, not because you're trying to, but because your internal orientation changed. That's the response. Not fireworks, not immediate miracles, but subtle realignment. And subtle realignment compounds. One 19-second moment leads to another. Continuity builds. Identity stabilizes. Reflection clarifies. You begin noticing fewer contradictions in your experience, not because life becomes perfect, but because your internal signal stops conflicting. Conflict dissolves when attention holds steady, and once conflict dissolves, momentum builds naturally. You don't need to push momentum. You just stop interrupting it. That's the quiet secret beneath all of this. You were never missing power. You were missing continuity. And continuity begins in seconds, measured, steady, uninterrupted, 19 seconds, held without retraction. That's enough to begin. And once you begin, you don't need to go back because you'll feel the difference immediately. Not dramatic, just undeniable. A quiet steadiness that wasn't there before. And once you taste steadiness, fragmentation feels obvious and unnecessary. So you stay just a little longer than before. And that's where the field responds, not loudly, not theatrically, just faithfully to what you consistently hold. There's a deeper layer beneath continuity. It's not about what you hold. It's about who you become while holding it. For years, you've approached change from the outside in. Adjust the strategy, improve the plan, refine the steps. But beneath every strategy was a fluctuating identity. An identity determines how long you can stay with something before you retreat. Retreat has been subtle, not dramatic withdrawal, just soft backtracking. You lean toward a new version of yourself, then glance back at the old one for reassurance. That glance is enough to reset the signal, because identity cannot stabilize while negotiating. 19 seconds without negotiation begins to close that loop. When you stop glancing backward, even briefly, something clicks. You feel less divided, less split between who you were and who you're becoming. Division drains energy. Integration restores it. You may have noticed how exhausting indecision feels. It's not the decision itself. It's the constant toggling between options. Toggling fragments attention. Fragmented attention weakens identity. Weakened identity produces inconsistent reflection. It looks like unpredictability, but it's internal oscillation mirrored outward. When you hold one orientation clearly, without toggling, your energy consolidates. Consolidated energy feels calm. Calm isn't passive, it's centered. Centered awareness moves differently through time. Time stops feeling like something you're chasing. It feels like something you're inhabiting. And when you inhabit time, urgency softens. Urgency often masks doubt. When you doubt, you rush. When you're aligned, you move steadily. Steadiness changes everything. It alters your tone, your posture, your timing. You may notice that when you speak from steadiness, people listen differently because steadiness carries coherence. Coherence is felt, even if it isn't consciously understood. Your internal field communicates more than your words. And when that field stabilizes, your external interactions align naturally. This isn't about influencing others. It's about no longer influencing yourself in contradictory ways. When contradiction fades, clarity emerges. Clarity simplifies choice. Simplified choice reduces hesitation. Reduced hesitation builds momentum. Momentum doesn't feel frantic, it feels inevitable. You felt inevitability before. Moments when something simply unfolded, not because you forced it, but because you were aligned with it long enough. Alignment creates inevitability, not instantly, but steadily. There's a version of you who doesn't overthink every step, who doesn't constantly re-evaluate their worth, who doesn't measure progress obsessively. That version isn't distant. It's a stabilized signal, a stabilized posture, a stabilized identity. An identity doesn't shift through dramatic declarations. It shifts through repeated continuity. 19 seconds is the bridge, short enough to attempt, long enough to matter. When you cross that bridge repeatedly, the distance between who you imagine and who you embody narrows. You stop trying to become. You start being. Being feels different. It's less intense, more grounded. It doesn't require constant reassurance. Because it's internally coherent, coherence reduces fear. Fear thrives on fragmentation. When you're split between outcomes, fear fills the gap. When you're steady in orientation, fear has less space to operate. You don't eliminate fear. You simply don't amplify it through divided attention. And when fear isn't amplified, it weakens. There's something profoundly empowering about realizing you don't need to fight anything. You don't need to conquer doubt. You don't need to silence resistance. You just need to hold a steady internal posture long enough for the noise to fade on its own. Noise fades when it isn't fed. Doubt fades when it isn't followed. Interruption fades when it isn't engaged. 19 uninterrupted seconds begins that fading process. You might feel a quiet confidence building as you consider this. Not excitement, not adrenaline. Just a sense that the shift has always been accessible, that you were never blocked, only divided. Division made progress feel slow. Division made clarity feel distant. But when division softens, the path feels shorter, not because the world changed, because you did. And you changed not through force, but through continuity. There's a kind of maturity in this, a recognition that alignment is quieter than ambition. That awareness is more foundational than effort. That identity is shaped not by dramatic breakthroughs, but by small, consistent acts of presence. You've been waiting for a sign that something external would confirm your direction, but the confirmation has always been internal steadiness. When you feel steady, you move differently. When you move differently, outcomes shift. Not because you manipulated anything, because you stopped contradicting yourself. There's relief in that. Relief in realizing you don't need to do more. You need to interrupt yourself less. Interruptions create a distance. Continuity dissolves it. And as distance dissolves, what once felt far begins to feel close. Not magically, naturally. You may notice now that the idea of waiting feels less relevant, because when you hold orientation consistently, you're no longer waiting. You're aligning. Alignment reduces the sense of time passing without progress. It replaces impatience with calm momentum. Momentum without strain. You're not behind. You're not late. You were simply scattered. Now you're gathering attention, gathering identity, gathering coherence. And when you gather, the field responds, not because it was silent before, but because your signal is finally clear enough to reflect. You don't need more information. You need more continuity. 19 seconds, repeated, without retraction, without negotiation, without interruption. That's where identity consolidates. That's where perception clarifies. That's where response begins to feel inevitable. And once you feel inevitability, you don't chase. You continue steadily, calmly, confidently, because you're no longer divided. You're aligned. And alignment reflects, always. There's nothing more to add, only something to remain with. You won't remember every sentence from this. You're not meant to. What stays isn't the wording, it's the sensation, the slight difference in how your attention feels right now. Less scattered, less rushed, more placed. You don't need to turn this into a practice. You don't need to monitor yourself. Just notice later, maybe when no one is around, how it feels to hold one internal direction a little longer than usual. Not forcing it, not proving anything, just staying. And when you stay, you may sense it again, that quiet moment when the internal noise softens and something aligns without effort. That's enough. You've always known that your perception shapes what feels real. You just hadn't stayed with it long enough to feel the shift. Now you have, not dramatically, not ceremonially, simply. 19 seconds is small, but small thresholds change trajectories. And the version of you who doesn't retract, who doesn't negotiate with every thought, who remains steady just a little longer, isn't far away. It's here, measured in moment. You'll close this video. Life will continue, but something subtle will feel different. Not because something new was given to you, because something fragmented became whole. And when wholeness holds, the reflection follows quietly, naturally, without announcement. You didn't learn something. You recognize something, and recognition doesn't end here. It continues. In the next 19 seconds, you choose not to interrupt.